Hi, everyone. We're going to revisit the issue we were looking at last night when we were looking at the Clementine recognitions, or so we thought. Actually, appears to have been the homilies. So we got confused, and that was a miscommunication between Mr. Peace and myself. So we were going to work that out. But what I decided to do was do a little more research on what's called the Syriac Clementine recognitions. And I'm going to ask the question tonight a little bit to begin the dialogue. Are the Syriac Clementine recognitions the real deal? And just for those who don't understand what we're talking about, is there's this literature that looks like it's dating from the first centuries, the first century of the church. This is before Paul even is involved in the church. It begins chronologically before he joins the church, and he's actually the enemy attacking the church when he was still a murderer type person towards Christians. So that it begins in that era, and then it grows where maybe things change later. And so that's the Clementine literature. And then there's what happened is what the Rufinus was a Roman Catholic translator in the 380s, 390s, early 400s, and he deliberately translated the Greek version of the recognitions or homilies, and I think they had both names, and apparently they were like two separate works, but they were like completely overlapping in many respects. And so he decided that he would translate them, and in the course of it, he obviously was changing things and making things look ridiculous. So the early church, the 12 apostles were made to look ludicrous. And so people look at it and go, "This is a fiction, a romance. It's just it's nonsense." And but that was it turns out that was Rufinus's objective, because it's become obvious that there was an original underlying text that was not ridiculous and was not absurd, but it was hard to find what that was. And the homilies is somewhat less, somewhat more bizarre, and that's what Luke Peace was telling us about the homilies, and I misunderstood him as talking about the recognition. So he provided me a copy of the text, and I'm going to show it to you here. So this is what he was looking at: the pseudo Clemens homilies, the Clementine homilies, and I'm going to just show you a little bit of the background on that. And you can see when we're looking at the homilies and the recognitions, we're looking at very rare texts. And on top of it, there's two sets, the homilies and the recognitions. They're very similar, but they have different titles, and they are actually two distinct works, yet they have identical word for word overlap between them. So that adds a little layer of like, what explains that? To me, it's like there was a first edition and then there's a second edition, would be one way of explaining it. So I'm just going to imagine in my mind that's what it is. So, and then you're going to find that there's, tracing of manuscripts, whether it's the homilies, or we're going to see today, we're going to look at the Syriac Clementine recognitions, because this looks very hopeful to me that we finally will get something about what's the original unvarnished look at the Clementine literature. So if you solve the Clementine recognitions and you find a reliable manuscript, you've also solved pretty much the Clementine homilies, because they're almost identical, with some additional text in one, and that's in one and not in the other, and vice versa. So as you would have with any rewrite of a book, the first book might have more text, and the second book might have some less text in certain places and more text in others. That's exactly what this looks like: a first edition, second edition, and one's given the name recognitions and one's homily. So let's kind of begin this journey, so you at least you'll have an idea of where I'm going here. So that he was Luke Peace. I've taken that video down because I want to make sure it doesn't. I had a misunderstanding. He was talking about the recognitions, but the work he gave me is actually the homilies. And so I just want to show you there is a difference. So it's sometimes the literature here is called the Clementines, and so Reverend Smith, when he introduces this, and this is from the 1880s, just so you know, he's writing in a very this edition is in the Ante-Nicene Fathers by Philip Schaff. So he says, we've already given an account of the Clementines in the introductory notice to the recognitions. So he sees the distinction I'm telling you. There's the recognitions, and then there's the Clementine homilies. All that remains for us to do here is to notice the principal editions of the homilies. The first edition was published by Cotellarius in his collection, The Apostolic Fathers, from a manuscript in the Royal Library of Paris, the only manuscript of the work that's known to exist. So I just want you to see, he's saying that the homilies are actually, there's only one manuscript that's known to have existed at the time he did this. He derived assistance from an epitome of the work which he found in the same library. So there's something called an epitome on top of the manuscript. The text of Cotellarius was revised by Clericus in his edition of Cotellarius, but more carefully by Schwegler in 1847. The Paris manuscript breaks off in the middle of the 14th chapter of the 19th book. Again, I'm just showing you what's the rarity of the manuscripts, you almost virtually unique, of the Clementine homilies. So he's now talking only about the homilies. And then what there are people who do what's called recensions. They go in and they try to figure it out more carefully. And there was an 1853 recension of the homilies. That's what he says here, and so on. And having found the complete manuscript of the 20 homilies in the Ottobonian Library in Rome. So now what's happened is no longer are they missing from the 14th chapter on. Now they have all 20 of the homilies, basically chapters. And so that's created now an extended version. It's a longer version, but apparently it's not materially different in the first 14. So now it's growing. The homilies is getting larger. And that's what Luke Peace was summarizing yesterday. And we could see, to me, what he told us shows us there's a lot of crazy stuff in there. It looks like this is the homilies looks like the version that Rufinus worked over in the Greek, making his Latin translation as he always did. He would translate from Greek to Latin and then destroy the Greek text so that you couldn't know what he did to corrupt it. And now we've seen he is a corrupter because he did this to Origen's work, and we've discussed what he did to Origen. Origen was one view on the Trinity, which he was anti-Trinity, and then when Rufinus finished with him, he translated the works involved, and then he destroyed them, and then suddenly Origen is pro-Trinitarian until we find the manuscripts in Greek revived themselves a couple decades ago, and now we know that the Rufinus is a huge corrupter. This is what he's done to the homilies. And now we're going to take a look at recognitions. Now, what I understand is the recognitions have been corrupted as well by Rufinus, but we don't know how much he did that. But when we go to the Syriac, it sounds to me like it's going to be even less that he got involved. And that's what I found tonight. And I was a little excited. So I want to share this with you, how this may be a breakthrough in history. And this only has been revealed since 2014. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are on the cusp. We're only 8 years from the discovery of these. Well, not discovery, but the manuscripts existed, but nobody was paying attention to the Syriac version, which turns out to be a very unique version compared to the Latin, or there are some Greek editions of the recognitions. Anyway, so now I'm going to move on from that introductory comment, but you could find that yourself if you just go to find this book by, it actually seems to have been downloaded from ccel.org, Schaff, Anti-Nicene Fathers 08, which I would assume it's their book 8. And you could look at that Clementine homilies if you want to look what Luke was looking at, Luke Peace was looking at. Okay, so let's move on here. And now this is sort of what prompted my attention. I was looking around about this, and this is in, there's something I subscribe to called the Academia. I don't even know what it is, but you get these academic articles that come to you, and you can either just keep downloading one at a time for free. Academics like to exchange papers and get your comment on them, and so you can participate, but you don't actually have to buy these things unless you want to do bulk downloading, and then you would have to pay a fee for that. So being semi-retired, I tend to just try to take the free version of everything. And here was this article by Joseph Gebhardt Klein, and I believe he is the translator of the text we're going to be talking about. Let me just double check. Yes. Well, Joseph Glenn Gebhardt is the author, translator, and is that the same person? Joseph Gebhardt Klein. Okay, now he's hyphenated his name. That's the only difference. So this seems to be the person who has translated the Clementine recognitions. So let's take a look at that. And he has some qualifications here. He's a Hebrew Syriac translator, topographer, editor of academia.edu. That's what I'm telling you. I subscribe to that service. A text contributor to Hebrew Union College's Comprehensive Aramaic Collection, Project 2014. Founding member of Temple Beth Or in Reno. Okay, I would assume he's perhaps Jewish. So he's interested in the Clement recognitions, not to take any position necessarily in Christianity, but sort of a curious bystander, it appears to me. So that's a good thing. I think he's not taking any particular point of view on this. And his article in the academia.edu notice tonight I saw was the Syriac Clementine recognitions and homilies, the first complete translation of the text. Now, he actually sent this, I think, years ago, and I did a Google search and it came up. And then it linked into my account, and then I downloaded it. So you get it free. So you can do the same thing. I think you just might have to subscribe to academia.edu, but you would still get this free. And so here it is, his book. He's sharing it free. What a great guy. So anyway, and then you see if you just go through the process of once you find that, well, I put up here here's how you can download it yourself, assuming you're a member or you subscribe. And again, it's free to subscribe. So you would go to this academia.edu and all this information. So come back to the screen and write it down, and then you can get it. He also publishes it through gravedistractions.com. So maybe you might want to look there for more information. Okay, so this is how he introduces the work. And this is, I'm going to stop right here, and then I'm going to begin reading this and commenting on it. Okay, so what he says is the following. This volume contains the first translation into any modern language of a work from the oldest dated manuscript in the world, British Library Additional Manuscript 12150. Sounds like the oldest manuscript of all time. Having a date corresponding to 411, 412 Christian era written on it. So the date is actually written directly on the document, which is very rare, based on facsimiles obtained from the British Library. The work, whose title was cut away from the manuscript at some unknown time, is one of the last surviving remnants of ancient Judeo-Christian philosophy and purports to be written by a first-century Roman philosopher named Clement, reputed to have been appointed Bishop of Rome by the Apostle Peter. Now, by the way, there is a Bishop of Rome known as Clement at this time, so that's... And this I would say this is attempting to say that person is the person who wrote these homilies. It's not a homily. These are the recognitions. We're looking at the Syriac recognitions. The text is in Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, the language of Jesus and his apostles, and has Hebraism pointing to a Palestinian origin. And he gives a footnote for that, by the way. See Samuel Lee's discussion of the language and origin in the manuscript's text type in Lee, editor, translator, and commentator, the Theophany. So if we went and downloaded this book, Theophania, Cambridge University Press, 1848, it will be a comment on this original manuscript. So apparently nobody's ever taken this manuscript and translated it. It's just simply commented by Samuel Lee and maybe partially translated. And he talked about the language that he saw showed what? A Palestinian origin. So this is not something made up at Rome. It's somebody who's living in Palestine, who's familiar with the dialect and familiar with the expressions. Okay. The recension of the text has never before been translated into English, although portions of it have, along with other versions, notably the Latin recognitions of Clement and the Greek Clementine homilies, commonly designated Clementines, which the Syriac has considerable divergences in content. So we're looking at something that he's saying is significant differences from both the recognitions in Latin and the Greek homilies And okay, and then he says, some of which has never been translated prior to this current volume. So we're reading for the first time in 2014 something that was recovered in the 1800s, or they had manuscripts of this, and the manuscripts date all the way back to the 400s, and are actually dated with dates that reflect the 400 AD period. The text presented here is intermediate in form to these other recensions, which, according to the ordinary laws of literary genealogy, would make it their likely ancestor. I'm not sure what he means by that, to be honest with you. Does he mean that it's they're, like you would say, my grandfather is my ancestor, so I would be his offspring? So it sounds like he's saying it's the origin of both the recognitions of Clement in Latin and the origin of the Greek Clementine homily. So it's older than those texts, which would mean we're getting closer to the original version of this. The story the work tells is presented in the autobiographical form of letters written by Clement of Rome to James, the brother of Jesus and head of the early Jerusalem congregation. That fits what we see in the book of Acts. The letters assume the form of a travelogue and contain discourses, dialogues, and debates. The first letter is the longest and explains how Clement grew weary of his philosophical studies in Rome and followed a Hebrew named Barnabas to Judea, where he befriends the apostle Peter, who instructs him in Jesus' teachings and the recent history of Jesus' followers. Now, we all know there was a companion of Paul named Barnabas, and we shouldn't assume that Barnabas is the same person unless that comes up later as we read. So I would just say it's a coincidence that the name is Barnabas for the moment, and maybe in time we'll learn it really is the Barnabas who knew Paul later. He records how the 12 disciples engaged in public debates on the temple steps for 7 days until an unnamed enemy storms into the temple, incites a riot, violently attacking James and throwing him down the steps, leaving him nearly dead, and Jesus' followers escape to Jericho. Now, by the way, this account is also in Eusebius, and it's in my account about the death of James. So I showed that there was a first time that James was thrown down, and it was Paul when he was going by the name of Shaul or Saul. And Josephus also has a simultaneous summary of this person, but calls him Saulus. And so you have multiple mentions of this original attack on James in the book of Josephus. I mean, think about this. The book of Josephus and here in the Syriac Clementine. And these look like they're legitimate summaries of an attack. But no one names the enemy here in the Syriac Clementines and just calls him the enemy. Now, does he know who he is? Does he know by the time he's releasing this book who this is? It's Paul or not? That remains to be seen. That's not really the point at the moment. We're trying to see, does this have literary value, or is it the same idea of Rufinus to make the authors of this, who obviously are Peter, in the sense that Peter is an influence over Clement, and Clement is a friend of Peter, and it treats Peter as a respected person. Is Peter made to look like he has ridiculous doctrines? Like we were summarizing to you the Clementine homilies. It turned out it was the homilies, not the recognitions, that I was looking at yesterday, and that, like I said, I've taken that video down because there was a misunderstanding between myself and Mr. Peace. My bad. I'm sure I didn't read carefully enough, and so that's why we're excited though that the Syriac Clementines are basically resolving the real dispute. We don't have to worry about these uh, ridiculous edits by Rufinus. We are getting behind him now. We are ahead. We are stepping one step backward, and we are finding the real edition. So we don't have to now worry about the Clementine homily, the Clementine recognitions that are the translation into Latin from Greek, and the Greek is all destroyed. That's not where we have to go. We can go here to the Syriac and look at the original version. It would be in the kind of language that somebody like Clement of Rome could speak in Aramaic, and he would write this down. So this is not implausible. Clement relates subsequently about Peter's preparation to debate a Samaritan sorcerer called Simon of Gethonanine, and the debates were recorded during a period of 3 days at Caesarea Stratton on the coast of Judea. So I want to say this. These debates here do appear to be, I've read this a little bit, do appear to be legitimately talking about Simon Magus now. So this is not the game that we're going to see going on with Paul in the books of the Clementines or the homilies, where it's really he's talking about Paul, and Rufinus changed it to be Simon Magus, so you don't see who it really is. So we're going to see what is the methodology of those. Are those passages still here, or are they gone? Is this no longer about Paul at all? It's possible. I don't know. See, we're going on a journey together. So we're going to find out as we read this. But I'm excited and I want to share with you this discovery because this is literally since 2014. It's been sitting in my computer for years, and I didn't pay attention to it. I didn't realize the significance of it. And because of what happened last night with Mr. Peace, and he's sending this to me, and there was some confusion, I decided I'm going to look this up, and that's why I dug out of my materials this Syriac Clementine issue, and now I think this could be the answer of what we need to be paying attention to. Anyway, so Simon is defeated in the argument. So this is really the true Simon Magus. And he's being exposed as a deceiver and imposter, claiming to be the resurrected Jesus, and he flees northward with the goal of traveling to Rome and promulgating a false religion. This is Simon Magus doing that. Peter follows after him with Clement as his travel companion and scribe. I'm going to pause for a minute. Okay, so let's move ahead a little bit more in this introduction. After the first letter, there are 5 shorter letters in which Clement documents their journey up the Syrian coast, recording Peter's discourses on a variety of religio-philosophical topics. They stay in the largest cities and refute the false teachings of Simon, who is always one step ahead of them. Eventually, on the Isle of Aradus, Clement is reunited through Peter's help with his long-lost mother, Matrodora, and subsequently with his twin brothers Faustus and Faustinus and father Faustus, who is revealed to be a relative of Caesar. The text ends with Peter and the reunited family planning to oppose Simon and a proponent of astrological fatalism and Eubion face-to-face at Antioch. Now that's interesting. That means Clement, the Bishop of Rome, in the future, that's his main role. His father is a person named Faustus, who is actually a relative of Caesar. So that's an interesting detail. Okay. So let's see. What am I doing here? Okay, I see. Besides being obscure, the genre of the work known as the Clementines is controversial due to presenting alternative doctrine and history in the first decade after Jesus than commonly assumed by Christianity. So if this has any legitimacy, which I mean, if the book of Acts could survive, what's to say there couldn't be a book of Acts of the apostles that actually Clement is recording and writing down his memoirs? I mean, maybe he realizes the significance of doing that and his experience over directly with one of the 12 apostles. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone would write it down, just like somebody would write down their experiences with Jesus. This seems to be what he's doing, and he's doing it more on a story basis. That's the only thing that he's using his writing ability. He's a very obviously educated person, so whoever's writing this. In consequence, there has grown up an excess of theories regarding the sources, the textual evolution, provenance, and historical value of this work. While the controversy has left open many possibilities, criticism has arrived at no consensus, and the Syriac text has remained obscure, unstudied, untranslated, and unpublished. Now, that's what really shocked me. So this is the author of the book putting this book out on academia.edu for free to those academics who want, those people who've signed up for academia.edu to look at the manuscript. You can make comments on it, and you can help the author, basically spread knowledge about his book to other people, which is kind of what I'm doing here. And I guess there's a way you can actually buy the book, and he makes money if you buy it in hardbound off of Amazon or something. So then maybe he's got some financial incentive to what he's doing. But At the same time, he's showing an interest in the actual success of the book by contacting people who would have interest in this kind of material and spread knowledge of it. So I guess I'm doing exactly what he'd like me to do. But I'm sorry I waited so long, Mr. Gebhardt. The enduring mystery surrounding this literature continues to allure scholars, and it's very interesting. I mean, you can't. It's a great story, one way or the other. If it turns out it's a fable, I don't think so. That's what, and you're going to see in this first segment. I'm going to pull out from the book. It is not a fable. This is actually a story that's in repeated by Josephus, who's writes somewhere around 100 AD as well, who writes a similar story to this. In fact, he could be looking at this, if you ask me. It sounds almost the same, or it's the other way around. But this sounds more like the intimate inside story versus what we see in Josephus. And then Eusebius, 200 years from now, from that point, is going to be able to look at this book, this Syriac Clementine recognitions, and he could use that to base his history on, or he could use Josephus. So anyway, so what is the truth regarding these curious writings? It is an enigma that is yet to be solved. So we're not going to solve this enigma, and but it's valid to the extent you can say in the Clementine. If we can find this book has not been corrupted by Rufinus, the crazy things aren't in here. That then we can say, okay, the Syriac. I would say this is where we're hoping to go. The Syriac Clementine recognitions are a valid work of history. They were recovered and by scholars who've done a good job in recovering it, and then finally got translated in 2014 by Mr. Gebhardt, who's an expert in Aramaic translations. You can see that's his background, and he's a Jewish scholar, so meaning he comes from a Jewish background. So he has no axe to grind, and either favoring Roman Catholics over Protestants or whatever in that respects. All right. So I also wanted to read you the first paragraph from this so that you just get a big flavor, and then I'm going to jump to what I think is the interesting part. So we'll take another break here right now. Okay, so the first chapter or the first paragraph. And by the way, he's putting in the parallels. So if you wanted to look at the other editions, the Latinized versions that Rufinus had created, they're called Recognitions 1:1 and Homilies 1:1. So they all start on the same place. So if we looked into those other editions, they'll have the similar paragraph opening, but maybe slightly different. So, but he's not telling us, Gebhardt's not telling us in what way it's different or similar. So he says this way. I, Clement, am from Rome, the city of the Romans, and in the early stage of my youth, I found that I should live in chastity and sobriety, for my thinking from my childhood throughout toil and sorrows was nullifying the desire within me, because there was within me a thought. Whence it took its beginning, I do not know. The grave reminder of death was at every moment set before me. For what now, after I have died, shall I not exist again, because I used to not even exist? And who will make remembrance of me now when this is so? If you only knew how we're still talking about him. Behold, time without end brings everything of everyone to naught and causes us to be forgotten. And shall I become now as I had not been, as having seen things become as if they had not been, when I neither know nor am known, as if neither having been nor being? And did this world come into being? When was it? And before coming into being, what was there? Or did it exist from eternity and throughout all time and to eternity? And if then it has come into being, even if must be dissolved, but after its dissolution, what shall be? Except perhaps silence and nothingness, or perhaps it is something impossible to be conceived. So he's a deep thinker, whoever he is. And so to me, you already want to trust him because he's writing in a way that's keeping all his options open. In other words, trying to understand the origin of the universe. Has it always existed? Is it created in time? These are very good questions, and this is the right kind of question you would ask to try to find out the answer. You have to know the question in order to find the answer. It's very hard to find the answer to a question you don't ask. Okay. Okay, so we'll move on to the next page that I've set aside to read. So this is at 1.65. This is the Syriac recognitions. and it reads as follows. And after I said these things, all the multitude of the priests cried out because I spoke openly about the destruction of the temple. And then after Gamaliel, a chief of the people, who for the sake of assistance was secretly a brother of ours. So I believe this is Peter talking, if I recollect. So Peter is sharing with Clement something. And so we're learning that Gamaliel is secretly helping them. A chief of the people who, for the sake of assistance, was secretly a brother of ours in the cause of the faith, had understood that they were increasingly gnashing their teeth, filled with intense wrath against us. He said these things, quote, "Desist and silence yourselves, O people, sons of Israel, for we do not know what this trial is that stands over us. Wherefore, let go of these men, and if this is an affair of human beings, it shall cease. If then it is from God, for what do you vainly sin while you cannot do anything? For the will of God always ought to overcome everything. And now, because the day has passed by today, tomorrow I will speak with them here before you so as to reprove their word of error." I'm going to pause there. Well, we can see this is reflected in a passage in the book of Acts. So the question is, did this exist first? And that's how Luke got it, by reading the Clementine recognitions. And I'm going to call it the Syriac Clementine so we make sure we're pinning it to this version. Did he have a version of the Syriac Clementine so when he wrote what he did? Or did the Clementine recognitions, did it decide to copy from Luke? This seems much more embellished, and it tells us something more about Gamaliel that you don't get from the book of Acts. And it's plausible. Gamaliel was on the side of the Christians. That would explain why he was taking such a tolerant view towards them. Now Gamaliel is a big name in Judaism, so this would be huge if it's true. And I would suspect if I was a Jewish person, I'd be suspicious. Why would this be so? But on the other hand, you might think to yourself, well, Gamaliel was still a great Jewish teacher, regardless, and Christians can be great teachers of the law. There's no reason they shouldn't be. Jesus wasn't the anti-law, so I think Jewish people can be open to this possibility as well. But anyway, I think the answer to this is unknown. But it's seems to me this is a more authentic account. Not authentic, because it's more detailed. It's more true. So you tend to, if whoever originated the story is always going to have more detail than the next person who repeats the story. That's just the nature of the way. You don't feel the need to write everything down. It doesn't serve your purpose in another context. So it seems to me more like Luke's heard the story, could have read it here, could have heard it secondhand some other way, and he doesn't need all the detail, and he's not going to use it. But he does use a similar quote of Gamaliel. Let's continue. They then, after gnashing their teeth and being filled with anger and wrath, became silent in the hope that on the morrow we would be reproved in error before all of them. He then promised this to them and peacefully dismissed the crowd. So Gamaliel is controlling the crowd, who are very angry with the Peter and the group for some reason, and Gamaliel is calming them down, and then they're all going to come back the next day. And I'm going to tell you a little preview here is that Paul is around. He's only really known as Saul, but he's not going to be named except as the enemy. So I think this is important for Christians to know that Paul is referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the enemy even after he's already joined himself to them. So they're going to have an interior meeting in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is Zadik, or righteous one, which Eisenman says is James the Just, and the word Zadik is the word of saying just in Hebrew. And the enemy is obviously Paul, and it's obviously after he's already tried to join or claimed to be a follower of Christ. So this label of enemy was something that was already they call it a sobriquet in French. It was already a way of referring to someone without having to say the person's name. So even at this early stage, he's just called the enemy and not given any dignity beyond that, not even to mention his name at that time. Now, in Josephus's version of this, he'll mention his name is Saulus, Saulus, which is a way of taking Saul or Shaul, taking that Hebrew name and making it sound Latin by just adding the Latin ending of us. So let's continue. dismissed the crowd. And then I kind of skipped over a little bit here. But anyway, page 41. All night we were praying that on the next day in the disputation, the cause of our truth would take hold and overcome. And then on the following day, even James the bishop went up with our multitude to the temple. We also found there a great crowd that was waiting for us. And when all of us stood in the places of the day before, so that by being in elevated places we could be seen by everyone. So they've gone up to a higher point where they can see everyone. So Bishop James is now not on the ground. He's up high where he can have a good view of things. And that's important because this detail, this fine detail kind of does sound like what an eyewitness could tell you to explain why is James where he is. He's going to be thrown down. Let me just tell you ahead of time. He's going to be thrown down, but you get this context of why he's there. That to me is what gives this credibility. It's a true story, like just as an eyewitness would recall. So anyway, when all of us stood in the places that day, so that by being in elevated places, we could be seen by everyone. So they wanted to be visually, like on a stage, but they're at the temple area, so they want to be able to be heard and be seen, and that kind of thing. And then after there was a great silence, Gamaliel, who I formerly mentioned for the sake of secret assistance was our brother, for they greatly retained the counsel of such as their associates, was therefore secretly keeping himself, so that when they schemed anything against us, we might know these things and thrust them away from us. And he, by a suitable counsel, might even peacefully change those against us by intercession. So this is showing you that they're getting favor from Gamaliel, and I assume I don't want to make any guesses, but again, this is one of those things where it does have a ring of authenticity, and it would be real easy to say, God by divine intervention saved us from the problems we were having, and not even think or give any appreciation to Gamaliel. But this seems to be sort of an intentional homage to someone who's probably dead at this point, Gamaliel, when this is being written, and trying to put a nice thank you to everything and show that he was a man of peace, and he wanted to avoid conflict between the Christians and the Jewish people, and try to find a way of abridging and avoiding conflict and mutual hostility, which is a very good thing. Anyway. So, however, he wisely spoke first as if he were our enemy. So he made it sound like he was their opponent at first, but that's a rhetorical thing that people can do. But let's see how he did it. He wisely spoke first as if he were our enemy, but it was planned by means of his occasion to persuade the people in the love of truth to hear the words spoken. So he was I don't want to say he was pretending, but he was saying, I'm here to tell you we need to listen to, if they have any truth, we'll find out. If not, if not. So he doesn't have to disclose where his biases are. He just has to say, let's listen to what they have to say. And that's fair. He doesn't have to say, I privately agree with them, or I've already come along to their opinions, or anything. He just have to say, we need to listen to them, and don't. But he doesn't take a position, and that's meaning he's taking officially a position of neutrality, and that's probably what a leader should do in this context. Okay, and he looked at James the bishop and began with his speech after this manner. So Bishop James begins. Okay, so in Recognitions 1:69, it begins. And thus in his speech, James even spoke about the prophets and demonstrated that everything they said they had taken from the law, and they had spoken things fulfilling its truth. And thereafter he spoke about the books of kingdoms, in what manner, when, and by whom they were written, but also in what manner one ought to use them. And thereafter they again spoke about the law, and he explained and showed through reason in what manner the things in it exist. And at last he spoke a word concerning the Messiah, and confirmed by many examples from every side without measure that Jesus is the Messiah, through whom were fulfilled all these things by his lowly coming. Because there are two comings of him, the first is lowly, and he came therein, but the second is glorious, wherein he comes and rules over those who believed in him, for they will do all the things he has commanded. And thereafter, he convinced the people while showing that except a person be baptized with life-flowing waters in the glorious threefold invocation. Now, we can see in the book of Acts, it's only one name that you're baptized into 8 times. So where did the word threefold come from? The Matthew was amended after 325 AD to say a threefold invocation. And how do we know it's 325? Because Eusebius 17 times quotes the baptismal formula in Jesus's final instructions, which was to baptize in my name. And he says 17 times. And then after Nicaea, it's changed to sometime after Nicaea, it's changed into, in his own work, into the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's how we know this was not original. And I would say this means there's been some editing even to this text. Okay. So that's just it's a red flag, and it's put in red. It's a sign of a Trinitarian hand. But so far, I don't see any effort to manipulate the text. Do you? That just sounds to me, other than that one exception. Okay, we're going to start over here so we hear the whole sentence. And by the way, I'm going to conclude this entire sentence was fabricated and it doesn't belong here. So just realize, I believe we can deduce there is some editing still going on from the future in the Trinitarian era into the past when there was no Trinity. And thereafter, he convinced the people while showing that except a person be baptized with life-flowing waters in the glorious threefold invocation, meaning the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the true prophet himself showed there shall be no forgiveness of sins for him, nor shall he enter into the kingdom of God. So not only was there no threefold baptism at that time, we can see that from the book of Acts 8 times. It's always in the name of Jesus. We can see that in Eusebius' own quotation of Matthew, the end of the passage dealing with baptism, he always says it's in the name of Jesus. So he says that until after 325, and then Eusebius changes. So we know the threefold invocation is after 325. And it could be as late as the 380s, because that's when the Trinity is officially adopted, and you now have 3 gods in one Godhead. So really, this means it could even be as late as the 380 period. And then the whole idea that you have to be baptized in order to have forgiveness of sins is not a message of Jesus Christ. I mean, the thief on the cross, he repented and stopped attacking Jesus and actually defended Jesus. He's saved, but it had nothing to do with being baptized. And so there's many of the other examples of that. So, and Jesus never even says you have to be baptized to be saved. It's a step of obedience. That's all it is, and shows your fidelity to Jesus Christ. And it's symbolic. If you want forgiveness, I'm sure that it's a good thing to do in the context of a proper, true repentance. But it's not a salvation type thing. I don't think so. Okay, he demonstrated that all predestination. All things are the predestination of the self-existent God through the concealment of his existence. Okay, that again, I think we're reading somebody else's writing here suddenly, because this is just really, this sounds like I don't want to say it's Pauline, but it's just simply, it's not a fisherman talking here anymore. And this is supposed to be James, the brother of Jesus, is talking. Did Jesus' brother talk this way? I don't think so. And along with these things, he said, therefore you should not think that we speak of the two self-existent ones, or one that is divided, or that one is a female vessel of itself, as the wicked say, a female male. Okay. This again, now we really are getting a lot of corruptions here. I mean, I think. What are you getting? Two self-existent ones, like Jesus and the Son are self-existent. So this is a Trinitarian now going back from 380s all the way back into this text and now corrupting it. So this is not free of corruption, that, in my opinion. I could be wrong. And then it talks about a female vessel of itself, as we could say, a female male. Like, so how can Mary be? So this is aware somehow. This portion is aware of the virgin birth, and it's trying to say, people call her, she's a female vessel, but she must be a male female that she can, impregnate herself. Okay, so this is really, really obviously not original. Okay, let me look here more carefully. However, he even talked about the Son, in what manner and by whom he is, and that he is not without a beginning. Oh my gosh, this is definitely the Trinitarian camp has come in here and just decided we're going to fill in some stuff here that doesn't really belong, and hopefully nobody will notice. So, however, he even talked about the Son and what manner and by whom he is, that he is not without a beginning. So this is taking actually the view of Arius, that Jesus had a beginning, as if he's been this pre-existent being, and in fact that's yeah. So that's what it's talking about. Not somebody who's had a natural birth, who then has the begotten sonhood happening at his baptism. So that's whoever's writing these words are no longer of the original mindset of the people who wrote the Gospels. Okay. Anyway, so and that it cannot now be said of him when it was, for even talked about the Son, in what manner and by whom he is, that he is not without a beginning, and that it cannot now be said of him when it was, for one ought secretly to set aside its existence. So I can just tell you, I can smell Roman Catholicism a mile away. It's when sentences stop making any sense. And it's all this, they made it, Christianity became all about, what do you think, who's Jesus? Instead of what Jesus taught. Did Jesus talk about his existence that much and who he really was? I mean, come on. You got three gospels that have nothing to do with that. You have John, who goes into it somewhat. But even there, if you pay attention, it's not that much in John either. Most of it's moral lessons again. But we get all of this, about the existence of Jesus, and anyway, it's just reeks of third, fourth century mentality here. He explained many things, even about the advocate and about baptism. So now we're getting into the Holy Spirit, right? So now you've got the Trinity again, and about baptism. And he persuaded all the people with the chief priests during 7 whole days to hasten from that place to go forward to baptism. Now that I do believe there was a desire in the early church to make people get baptized, because we see that in the book of Acts, chapter 3. And let's just read the next line, and Recognitions 1, verse 70. And thereafter, one man who was an enemy. Now, this is Paul. We know who it is. Along with a few other men, went up to the temple next to the altar while shouting and saying, "What are you doing, O men, son of Israel?" Okay, and this story, I believe, is going to be repeated in other sources. It may have been Josephus and Eusebius, or both. And I'm going to just skip ahead here. So, just so we know, this is going to, I'm pretty sure it's in Josephus, where James is thrown down by Saulus. So the name doesn't appear here. He's just called the enemy. But in Josephus, he's called Saulus, which is obviously Shaul's name Latinized into Latin ending of US. And we'll see here, I'm just going to race ahead, the enemy, and then the enemy cast James down from above the steps, but after he fell and became as if dead, he did not beat him a second time. So he left him alone. He falls to the ground. He gets knocked out, but he doesn't beat him to death. Now that's how James is eventually going to be killed, is he's going to have a similar fall a second time, and then they're going to beat him with something in the head, and crack his head open and kill him. So it's just funny. I'm funny. It's how he dies eventually. It's very similar to the way he is attempted to be killed at this time. So anyway, I'm just going to stop it there. I think we've had enough, and I want to keep this episode short enough that you can listen to it in a lunch break, or in a short period of time during the day. So anyway, we're going to follow up on this. We're going to go deeper into the recognitions and see what we can find. As you can see, it's treading, but there is actually, this is a text we're reading about the casting of James down from the temple by Saul. Shaul. This is recognized in, I think it's Josephus's work. So it's not. It's with merit. In other words, you're learning something more about the background of James, and but hopefully we're going to learn more things about the early church through this. But we have to be on guard. Anytime they talk about the nature of Jesus Christ, they're going to just always have to try to throw in something about the Trinity. They're just obsessed with it for some reason. And but you can't believe that the first century church is talking about threefold blessedness. Can you really believe that? And it's not in the book of Acts. You've got 8 baptisms, and there's no mention of baptism in the name of anything but Jesus, and now we're getting threefold blessedness in the first century in this book. No, that's totally the editorial hand of a later voice from the 380s. And remember, this manuscript is from what year? 411 to 420, somewhere in there. So it's actually dated about 20 years after the Trinity has been 30, almost 30 years after the Trinity has been adopted. So this is reflective of its time of being prepared. So yeah, we have good reason to. The only thing we need to question is when they do the Trinitarian vows. And by the way, does that not tell you that the Trinitarian party doesn't care about truth? This is not a desire to preserve a book. This is a desire to contaminate a book with the idea that these people could have had Trinitarian ideas in the first century. They don't care about truth. It's preposterous stuff that they're doing. And this is what is it called? It's brainwashing, controlling the narrative, and using records. And also think about this. Why is this one of the most rarest books on earth? And yet you can see it was a very detailed work. This guy must have spent a lot of time and money, and he wasn't poor. His family was related. Clement is related to the Caesar. So this is probably not a poor family, and they were spreading this book around because they wanted people to know. And yet the Catholic Church had such power, they knew they could destroy every copy and then reissue the book this way with Trinitarian fouls all over it. So, yeah, we may end up having to conclude that Rufinus is going to edit this too, because this is definitely in his ballpark of time. So, yeah, my hopes are dashed a little bit here. So we'll see. Maybe this is an early version and he didn't really affect it as much. And it's in Syriac, so maybe he doesn't know how to translate from Syriac into Latin. He knew how to translate Greek into Latin. He wouldn't know how to translate Syriac into Latin. So it depends what was the original text that the Syriac was rendering from. So we're gonna have to make some decisions as we go along. But anyway, it's exciting. It's a possibility. It's something that we need to know about. And then if anybody asks us about it, we can have an opinion about it. So all these ancient texts are always interesting, no matter what. And what did we also learn? We learned that the Trinitarian party of Roman Catholicism, and Rufinus in particular, did not care about taking the Trinity from the 380s. There's no Trinity doctrine until 381. None. It was literally invented for one conference. It wasn't at Nicaea, as most people think. Nicaea is only by deity, two gods in one Godhead. Then in 381, Gregory of Nyssa and Theodosius, the emperor, decide, hey, let's create a third God, make the Holy Spirit not the emanation of God's Spirit, but actually a separate God of a separate mind. And this will, and literally, there's a book where they describe what their purpose was: to destroy the myth. They called it the myth of monotheism. And that's in the book called The Great Catechism. It was released by the Catholic Church. It's one of the most well-publicized books of history, and you can't retract it now. That's what it said. And Philip Schaff mentions this 3 times. He says, this is what it's saying. Okay, the myth of monotheism. Those who are in the error as to the one, that there can only be one God, they're in error. And we've got it. We got 3 gods and one God. It's still one God, but it's really still 3 gods. So it doesn't endorse polytheism, but at the same time, it disproves monotheism. So if you can live with these kind of verbal games that Theodosius and Gregory of Nyssa went through, they can talk out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. But the bottom line is their intention was ill conceived and improper. And this is not something that was invented. There was no threefold blessedness in the first century when this book was written. So we just have to realize there is a lack. So we've learned another fact is we have a lack of ethics of those who believe in the Trinity. Whether you believe in the Trinity or not, it didn't make you a better person, because they were literally willing to create forgeries into the past, forge their viewpoints into a document well after the time that it could possibly have been thought about or even conceived, to make it look like it had been there all the time. And I'll just leave you with one more thought. George Orwell. How do you control the future? You control the past. How do you control the past? You control the records. That's what the party of Big Brother tells Winston. That Winston's told they tell him, we're at peace with, I think it's Oceania, and we're at war with, Transylvania, whatever. And he goes, oh, and the party guy says, we've always been at peace with Oceania, and Winston's going, no, no, that's not what I remember. We were at war with Oceania for years. And the guy says, "But if we say that never been at war with Oceania, that's the way it is." And then he says, "No, no, but there's records." And so the party's guy saying, "As long as we can destroy the records, we can control the future by controlling the past. And control the past, we just have to control the records." And that's actually been a successful management of this issue with the Trinitarian doctrine, which is by controlling the records, corrupting records of the past. People think it's always been there when it really had not been there. But there's always the telltale signs. The truth is always much more stronger than lies. And that's how we know. I mean, so if you see, so anyway, I'll leave it there. Good night. I've said enough, but there's a lot of benefit you learn even when you see a corruption. It teaches you how to spot them. All right. God bless. Take care. Ciao.